fired." Those 2 words didn't just end my career. They signaled the start of a nightmare I had spent 3 long years trying to prevent. As I stood in the plush, suffocating silence of the CEO's office, staring into the eyes of Julian, the man I had purged from this company for his toxic resistance years ago, the air completely left my lungs. He wasn't just back. He owned the building, and the cold, predatory look in his eyes told me that the inclusive world I had built was about to be burned to the ground. "My name is Maya, and for the last 36 months, I've served as the Director of People and Culture, a role I took on with the fervor of a missionary tasked with cleaning up a den of inequity. I spent most of my early career watching brilliant, qualified women get sidelined by loud-mouthed, mediocre men who failed upwards simply because they knew the right people. Not on my watch anymore. I made it my personal mission to ensure that the old guard was held finally accountable for every microaggression and every unearned advantage. Today started like any other Monday, with me checking emails and preparing for my weekly mandatory cultural alignment session, a cornerstone of my strategy for workplace equity. These sessions were designed to educate those who needed it most, particularly the men who had spent decades navigating the corporate world with zero self-awareness or empathy. Honestly, it was exhausting having to constantly teach grown adults the basics of human decency, but I viewed it as the necessary tax of progress. Walking through the lobby at 9 a.m. sharp, I noticed the usual suspects huddled around the expensive espresso machine, their whispers dying down as my heels clicked on the floor. I could practically smell the resentment radiating off of them, a toxic mixture of fear and entitlement that they tried to mask with forced, hollow professionalism. There was Mark from DevOps, David from QA, and Leah from the front-end team, all looking like they'd rather be anywhere else in the world. "Here comes the fun police," I heard one of them mutter, a comment I chose to ignore but silently filed away for their next annual performance review. They think I don't hear their little remarks or catch the way they rolled their eyes, but I see and hear every subtle shift in this office. I sat at my desk and reviewed my notes for the morning's workshop, which focused specifically on recognizing the male default in technical spaces. I had prepared a list of seemingly innocent phrases, things like, "You're surprisingly technical," or "Let's man the station," that I planned to explain were actually psychological microaggressions. 10 a.m. arrived, and I headed to Conference Room B, where 15 employees were filing in with the enthusiasm of a chain gang. Mark was slumping in his chair like a teenager, forced to attend a Sunday school lesson he didn't believe in. David kept checking his smartwatch every 30 seconds, clearly signaling that he had more important technical things to be doing than learning. I began the presentation with a slide deck detailing the statistics of workplace discrimination and the psychological cost of being othered in tech. Immediately, the hands went up with questions that were really just poorly disguised attempts to derail the conversation before it could begin. "Maya, don't you think we should focus on coding skills instead of these social theories during work hours?" David asked, his voice dripping with condescension. I told him that his defensive attitude was exactly why the session was necessary, as technical skill means nothing without a safe and inclusive environment. He exchanged a loaded look with Mark, a silent solidarity that I had spent years trying to dismantle within the engineering department. I moved on to the topic of inclusive language, suggesting that terms like team or everyone were far superior to gendered defaults. Leo snapped that this was getting ridiculous and that we were making everything too complicated for no reason in a high-stress environment. I reminded him that just because he wasn't personally affected by a word didn't mean it wasn't harmful to his colleagues' sense of belonging. "Your impact matters more than your intent, Leo," I said, a phrase that usually silenced them but today seemed to only deepen their scowls. I noticed several men shifting uncomfortably, and I leaned into that discomfort because I believe it is the only way real learning occurs. To drive the point home, I brought up the product launch meeting from last month where a female dev, Sarah, was interrupted 4 times. When Mark finally suggested the exact same UI redesign later in that same meeting, he was praised as an innovator, while Sarah's idea was ignored. Mark exploded instantly, claiming he hadn't even heard Sarah's suggestion and accusing me of manufacturing a narrative to make him look like a villain. "That's exactly what I mean by gaslighting, Mark," I replied calmly. "Instead of examining the space you take up, you're making excuses." The session ended with a thick cloud of hostility hanging in the air, but I viewed it as a successful disruption of their privilege. I spent the afternoon documenting their resistance, convinced that I was on the right side of history and that management fully had my back. At 3:15 p.m., an urgent email from the CEO's assistant arrived, announcing a mandatory all-hands meeting for Tuesday morning at 9 a.m. sharp. I assumed it was a budget increase for my department, or perhaps a new day initiative that I had been lobbying for over the last quarter. Tuesday morning arrived, and the air in the lobby was electric, with groups of men whispering with a strange, frantic intensity. When I entered the auditorium, I saw the CEO looking pale and nervous, standing next to a tall man whose face was initially obscured. "I'd like to introduce the man who has just acquired this company, new owner and CEO. Julian," the old CEO announced with a shaking voice. My heart didn't just drop. It felt like it had been extracted from my chest as I recognized the face of the man I fired. Julian, once a lead architect here, had apparently built a rival software empire and returned to by the very company that had discarded him. He stood before the crowd, his eyes scanning the room until they locked onto mine with a cold, predatory focus that made my skin crawl. 2 years ago, I was told I was a cultural misfit and escorted out of this building by security, Julian said into the microphone. I've spent every day since then proving that the only thing toxic about this company was the person who tried to destroy my reputation. He looked directly at me and said, "Maya, my office." Now, leaving the rest of the staff in a state of stunned, murmuring shock. I followed him to the executive suite, my hands trembling despite my best efforts to appear composed and professional in front of the staff. He sat behind the massive mahogany desk that used to belong to my greatest ally and gestured for me to sit in the guest chair. "Julian, I'm sure we can find a professional way to move forward despite our past misunderstandings," I began, trying to sound authoritative. He laughed, a short, sharp sound that cut through my attempt to regain control of the narrative like a hot knife through butter. "Is that what you call it, Maya? Firing me and blacklisting me because I asked for the data behind your claims?" he asked. I tried to defend my record, stating that his behavior had created a hostile environment for the women on his team back then. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a thick, leather-bound folder that looked like it contained a lifetime of evidence. "I've spent 3 years and a lot of money on private investigators and lawyers, Maya. I have the files you thought were deleted," he began reading from the folder confidential HR notes I had written about Mark, David, Leo, and dozens of other men over the years. He pointed out that I had consistently ignored complaints filed by men while fast-tracking every single grievance filed by women, regardless of the evidence. "You created a system of guilty until proven male, Maya, and you did it under the guise of progress," Julian said. I tried to argue that I was simply correcting a historic imbalance, but he shut me down with a sudden, sharp flick of his wrist. He hit the intercom and asked the witnesses to enter, and the door opened to reveal the very men from yesterday's session. David from QA spoke first, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and triumph as he looked at me with pure loathing. "For 3 years, you held my career hostage. Maya, you told me I wouldn't get a promotion until I acknowledged my inherent bias." Mark followed, accusing me of intentionally misinterpreting his technical disagreements with female colleagues as gender-based aggression to justify a pay freeze. Even Leo revealed that I had pressured his direct reports to find problematic behavior in his past so I could build a termination file. One by one, they laid out a pattern of systemic harassment, retaliation, and professional sabotage that I had convinced myself was just equity. Julian turned the monitor on his desk around to show me a series of video clips from my own training sessions over the years. In the clips, I was seen mocking the men in the company, calling them fragile relics to my assistant during a lunch break. "That's called a hostile work environment, Maya. And it's quite illegal when it's based on a protected characteristic like gender," Julian said. I felt the walls closing in, the legal reality of my revolutionary methods finally catching up to the professional consequences I had ignored. I tried to argue that my intentions were good, that I was trying to save the company from its own worst, oldest impulses. The men in the room weren't buying it. They stood in a semicircle around me, their faces etched with the pain of years. "You didn't want a fair workplace, Maya. You wanted a kingdom where you were the only one allowed to define the truth." Leo's words cut deep because I realized, in that moment, that he was right. I had enjoyed the power far more than the progress. Julian stood up, towering over the desk, and informed me that he had already filed a countersuit against me for professional interference. He told me that he had interviewed 32 former employees who all had similar stories of my reign of terror and illegal practices. The board had already voted to terminate me for cause effective immediately, meaning I would leave with nothing but my personal belongings. I tried to mention my severance package, but he laughed again, telling me that I'd be lucky if I didn't end up bankrupt. He gave me exactly 10 minutes to gather my things, with a security team waiting at the door to ensure I left quickly. Walking back to my office was the longest journey of my life. The gauntlet of staring employees, now feeling like a firing squad. I saw Sarah from marketing, the woman I thought I was protecting, looking away as I passed, refusing to even acknowledge my existence. It hit me then that I hadn't built a community of empowered women. I had built a culture of fear that benefited no one. I packed my feminist CEO mug and my books on systemic change into a single, flimsy cardboard box, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The silence in my office was deafening, a sharp contrast to the celebratory cheers I could hear coming from the break room down hall. Julian appeared in my doorway one last time as I was heading toward the elevator, his expression no longer angry, but pitying. "You know, Maya, the irony is that I actually believed in most of the goals you were trying to achieve," he said. "But you were so addicted to the power of being the victim's champion that you became the very bully you hated." I didn't have a witty comeback or a profound equity slogan to throw back at him. I just felt incredibly, hollowly small. I stepped into the elevator, the doors closing on the world I had built, leaving me alone with the weight of my choices. As I walked out into the bright Tuesday sun, the diversity and inclusion banner above the door looked like a mockery of my life. I sat in my car for 20 minutes, staring at the steering wheel, wondering how the good guy could lose so completely. I thought about the files Julian had, the recordings, and the voices of the men who had finally stood up to me. Was it possible that in my rush to level the field, I had accidentally built a new kind of mountain for myself? The drive home was a blur of traffic and tears, the reality of my blacklisted status beginning to sink into my weary mind. Julian had his revenge, but more than that, he had his justice, and I was left with nothing but a box. One thing was for certain, the boys' club was a problem, but my star chamber had been a catastrophe of my own. I had used the language of empathy to justify a lack of it, and the world had finally called my bluff. I looked at the motivational quote on my coffee mug, "Be the change you wish to see," and I realized I finally was. I was the change, just not the version I had ever imagined when I started this journey 3 long years ago. As I pulled into my driveway, I knew that tomorrow would be the first day of a very different, quieter life. Julian had won, and as much as it burned to admit it, he had won by using the very rules. The fight for equity would continue, but it would have to find a leader who didn't mistake cruelty for a noble cause. I spent the evening staring at my phone, waiting for a call that I knew would never come from my former allies. My reputation was in tatters, and the legal fees would likely drain whatever savings I had managed to scrape together recently. I had set out to break glass ceilings, but I had only succeeded in creating a house of mirrors and glass. Every person I had educated was now a witness against me, and every breakthrough I had recorded was now a piece of evidence. I realized that true inclusion cannot be built on a foundation of exclusion, no matter how righteous the original intent might feel. I had ignored the humanity of the men in my office, and in doing so, I had lost my own humanity. The sun set on my career, and for the first time in years, I had nothing to say, and no one. The silence of my house was a mirror of the silence I had imposed on so many others during my tenure. I wondered if Sarah or the other women would truly be better off now that Julian was in charge of things. Perhaps they would finally be judged on their merits, rather than being used as pawns in my personal war against the past. I fell asleep dreaming of Conference Room B, but in my dream, I was the one sitting in the back. I was the one being lectured, the one being told that my existence was a problem that needed to be solved immediately. When I woke up, the realization that I was no longer in power was both a weight and a strange relief. No more sessions, no more documentation, no more fighting a battle that I had already lost in my heart long ago. I was just Maya again, a woman who had tried to change the world and ended up changing only herself. The phone finally rang, but it was just a reporter asking for a comment on the scandal at the tech firm. I hung up without speaking, finally understanding the value of silence in a world that had become far too loud. Julian had his company, the men had their peace, and I had a long road of self-reflection ahead of me. The script was finished, the curtain had fallen, and the audience had already left the theater to go back home.
If this confession kept you hooked, make sure to subscribe, like, and share. We share powerful true stories every day that explore the complex realities of life.